There is a moment most of us have experienced, but few of us talk about honestly. It comes at 2 in the morning, when the house is quiet and the world outside has finally stopped demanding things from you. You're lying there, staring at the ceiling, and something heavy settles onto your chest, not a medical emergency, not a panic attack, just the quiet, suffocating weight of everything you are still carrying. The argument from 3 years ago that you replay differently in your head each time, always finding a new way you could have won it. The relationship that ended but somehow never really ended because you still check their social media, still wonder what you did wrong, still rehearse the conversation you never got to have. The career path you abandoned, the opportunity you missed, the version of yourself you were supposed to become by now. You carry all of it, every single day. And the terrifying thing is that you've carried it so long, you no longer notice where you've just accepted that this is what life feels like. But here's what behavioral psychology has discovered, and what the most resilient, creatively alive, and genuinely successful people have figured out the hard way: that weight is not wisdom, that holding on is not loyalty, and that the single most powerful skill you can develop in the modern era, more valuable than any technical certification, more transformative than any morning routine, more profitable than almost any investment you can make, is the ability to let go, not forget, not pretend it didn't happen, not bypass the grief or the anger or the disappointment, but to genuinely, skillfully, and deliberately release what is no longer serving the person you are trying to become. This is not a motivational platitude. This is a survival skill. Because we are living through a period of history that is changing faster than any human nervous system was designed to accommodate. Artificial intelligence is reshaping entire industries in the span of months. The career that felt stable 5 years ago is wobbling. The identity you built around your job title, your relationship, your social circle, your hometown, all of it is being disrupted simultaneously. And the people who are going to navigate this era with clarity and purpose are not the ones with the most information. They are the ones who have learned to release what no longer fits, quickly and without excessive guilt, so they can move with the current rather than drown fighting it. What you are about to hear is not a collection of abstract philosophy. It is a set of deeply practical, psychologically grounded lessons drawn from Trenton's work on the art of letting go. Lessons that address why we hold on even when holding on is destroying us, how our brains conspire against our own freedom, and what it actually looks and feels like to release the things that are keeping us trapped. 7 lessons, each one harder to hear than the last, each one capable of changing the entire trajectory of your life if you let it land. Let's begin. The first lesson is the one that most people resist most forcefully because it strikes directly at something we were all taught to value: effort. We live inside a culture that worships persistence. We're raised on stories about people who refused to quit, who held on through impossible circumstances, who were told no 100 times and kept going until they heard yes. And those stories are real. Persistence does matter. But there is a psychological phenomenon that runs alongside all that celebrated perseverance, and it quietly bankrupts people emotionally, financially, and creatively every single day. It is called the sunk cost fallacy, and understanding it is the foundation of everything else in this book. The sunk cost fallacy is the deeply human tendency to continue investing in something, a relationship, a business, a career path, a belief system, not because it is still working, but because of how much you have already put into it. The logic, if you can call it that, goes something like this: I have spent 3 years on this startup. If I walk away now, those 3 years mean nothing. So I will spend another year, and then another. And the tragedy is not just that the startup may still fail. The tragedy is that you have now spent 4 years doing something that is not working, because you could not bear to accept that 3 years were already gone. The loss of the 3 years felt catastrophic, but adding a 4th year of loss to avoid accepting the first 3 is not courage. It is a cognitive trap dressed up as perseverance. Researchers at the University of Michigan ran a series of experiments in which they gave participants a choice between 2 options: continuing down a path they had already invested significantly in, or switching to a clearly better alternative. Overwhelmingly, people chose to continue the original path not because it was better, but because abandoning it felt like admitting failure. Our brains are not wired to absorb loss neutrally. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, whose work underpins much of what we understand about decision-making, demonstrated that the pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equivalent value, which means that every time you contemplate walking away from something you have invested in, your emotional system is producing a distress signal that is twice as loud as the signal your rational mind produces when it points to a better path ahead. This plays out everywhere. It plays out in the freelancer who keeps a toxic long-term client because dropping them feels like giving up revenue, even though that client takes more energy than 5 better clients combined and is actively preventing the business from growing. It plays out in the person who stays in a career they find suffocating because they have a graduate degree in it, and switching would mean admitting the degree was a mistake. It plays out in companies, even massively successful ones, who continue pouring resources into products that the market has clearly rejected because the internal team has too much ego and identity invested in being right. Kodak did not fail because digital photography was unforeseeable. Kodak failed because the people who built their careers on film technology could not let go of the assumption that film would always matter. The sunk cost was not just financial, it was psychological. It was identity. The actionable shift here is not to become someone who quits easily. It is to develop the habit of asking a single clarifying question whenever you are trying to decide whether to continue something. If I was starting fresh today, with no prior investment, would I choose this? Would I choose this relationship, this career, this business model, this belief about myself? If the answer is genuinely yes, then continue, and you are not continuing out of sunk cost bias. You are continuing because it still makes sense. But if the honest answer is no, and you will know it when you hear it, because the stomach drops just a little, then what you are experiencing right now is not loyalty. It is the trap. And the first act of letting go is recognizing the trap for what it is. The second lesson moves deeper, into territory that is more personal and more uncomfortable. Because while sunk costs explain why we hold on to things that are no longer working, they do not fully explain why we hold on to pain, why we replay arguments, why we rehearse old grievances, why we can describe in vivid, emotionally loaded detail something that happened to us a decade ago, as though it happened last Tuesday. The answer lives inside the psychology of rumination, and it is more insidious than most people realize. Rumination is not the same as reflection. Reflection is when you examine a past experience in order to extract a lesson, update your understanding, and move forward differently. Rumination is when you return to a past experience over and over again without any new information, without any new insight, and without any resolution, simply circling the same painful material in an endless loop that feels like thinking but is actually a form of mental self-punishment. Research from Yale psychologist Susan Nolan-Huxima, who devoted much of her career to studying this pattern, found that people who ruminate chronically are significantly more likely to develop depression and anxiety, significantly less likely to take constructive action in their lives, and significantly worse at solving problems, not because they care too little, but because they are spending so much cognitive and emotional energy on the loop that they have nothing left for forward. Motion here is what makes rumination so seductive and so hard to interrupt. It feels productive. When you are running the same argument through your head for the 100th time, some part of your brain believes you are working on it. You are processing, you are analyzing, you are making sure you understand what happened, but you are not. You are rehearsing. And every time you rehearse a painful memory, you are not weakening it, you are strengthening it. This is not metaphor, this is neuroscience. Every time a neural pathway is activated, it becomes more efficient, more automatic, more likely to fire spontaneously in the future. Rumination is, quite literally, practice for pain. The modern context makes this exponentially worse. Social media was not designed with human psychology in mind, it was designed with engagement in mind, which turns out to be very different. Every time you check an expert in his profile, you are not finding closure. You are reopening a wound that your brain was beginning to heal. Every time you scroll through the highlights of someone else's life while sitting with the low points of your own, you are not getting information. You are feeding a comparison loop that has no bottom. The digital environment we now inhabit creates frictionless pathways back to the things we are trying to move away from, and it requires deliberate, conscious architecture to counteract this. Letting go of rumination does not mean suppressing your emotions. Suppression is actually counterproductive. Research by Daniel Wegner demonstrated that actively trying not to think about something makes you think about it more. A phenomenon he called the ironic process theory, famously illustrated by telling someone not to think about a white bear and watching as the white bear immediately dominates their mind. What actually works is a practice called cognitive diffusion, developed within acceptance and commitment therapy. Instead of fighting the thought or trying to make it disappear, you practice observing it from a slight distance. You notice it. You name it. You say to yourself, not I am still so angry about what happened, but I notice that I am having the thought that I am still angry about what happened. It sounds like a subtle linguistic shift, but it creates a critical separation between you and the thought, a gap in which your agency lives. You are not your rumination. You are the consciousness that can observe the rumination and choose, moment by moment, where to direct your attention next. The third lesson is perhaps the most counterintuitive one in this entire book, and it is the one that challenges the most deeply held belief in personal development culture. We have been told repeatedly, earnestly, and with great enthusiasm that the solution to emotional pain is to discover our authentic self, to know who we really are at our core, to build a strong, stable identity and then defend it. What behavioral science has actually found is that this approach, when taken to its logical conclusion, creates one of the most powerful obstacles to letting go that exists. It is called identity foreclosure, and it explains why genuinely intelligent people sometimes become the most rigid, most offensive, and the most unable to change. When your sense of self becomes too tightly fused with a particular belief, role, relationship, or achievement, any threat to that thing becomes a threat to your existence. Not metaphorically, neurologically, your brain processes identity's threat in the same regions it processes physical danger, which means that when someone challenges your long-held belief, or when circumstances force you to reconsider a role you have inhabited for years, your body is producing a fear response. You are not being dramatic, you are being human. But the consequence is that people will protect their identity even when doing so actively harms them. People will double down on beliefs that are demonstrably false rather than experience the psychological vertigo of updating their worldview. People will stay in relationships or careers that are slowly diminishing them rather than endure the disorientation of not knowing who they are without those contexts. This is not a failure of intelligence or character. It is a design feature of the human mind operating in the wrong environment. Our brains evolved to maintain continuity of self because, for most of human history, consistency of identity was essential to survival. You knew who you were, what your role was, where you belonged. That clarity kept you alive. But in a world where industries are being reinvented by AI in 18 months, where the skills that made you valuable 2 years ago may be partially automated next year, where relationships and communities and even geographies are more fluid than they have ever been, the ability to hold identity loosely, to explore rather than defend, is not weakness. It is the new competitive advantage. The psychologist Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset touches the surface of this, but the deeper implication is often missed in the way her research gets popularized. It is not just about believing you can improve your skills. It is about developing what we might call a fluid identity, a relationship with yourself that is defined not by what you currently are, but by your capacity to become. People with fluid identities do not need to cling to past achievements because their self-worth is not primarily housed in those achievements. They do not need to reject new information because their identity does not depend on being right. We can exit a failing business without experiencing it as total personal collapse because they understand that the business was something they did, not something they would dot practically. This means developing the habit of holding your current beliefs. When it rolls with a light grip, it means getting comfortable saying, "I used to think that," and treating it as a mark of growth rather than an admission of error. It means experimenting with new identities before you need to, taking on small projects in adjacent fields, exploring unfamiliar ideas, putting yourself in rooms where you are the least experienced person, so that when a major transition is forced upon you, your brain already has some experience with the discomfort of not yet knowing, and knows that it survived. The fourth lesson brings us to forgiveness, and I want to address it with the directness it deserves, because it is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of popular psychology. Forgiveness is not about the other person. It is not a gift you give to someone who hurt you. It is not a declaration that what they did was acceptable. It is not reconciliation, and it does not require their participation or even their awareness. Forgiveness, in the psychological sense, is a decision you make entirely for your own benefit, and the research on its effects is so consistent and so striking that ignoring it is essentially choosing to remain injured. Studies conducted at Stanford University's Forgiveness Project, led by Dr. Fred Luskin, found that people who practiced forgiveness, particularly forgiveness of significant betrayals, experienced measurable reductions in anger, depression, and physical symptoms of stress. They reported higher levels of hope, greater life satisfaction, and improved physical health markers. This is not because they pretended the wrong never happened. It is because they stopped allowing someone else's past actions to continue governing their present internal state. The unforgiven grievance is, to use Luskin's framing, a story you keep telling yourself, a story in which you are the victim. The other person is the villain, and justice has never been served. And every time you tell that story, you pay for it again. Your cortisol spikes, your muscles tighten, your attention narrows. You're re-experiencing the original injury in your body, in the present moment. The person who hurt you, in most cases, is not thinking about it at all. This is the bitter irony of unforgiveness. The sentence falls entirely on the person carrying the grievance. You are not punishing them by holding on. You are punishing yourself, repeatedly, with the same instrument, for something that has already ended. And in the modern context, this becomes especially toxic when the grievance is attached to professional life. The business partner who betrayed you, the employer who treated you unjustly, the colleague who took credit for your work. If you carry those experiences as defining wounds, they will flavor every new professional relationship you enter. You will see betrayal coming before it exists. You will create distance as a protective measure that actually prevents the kind of trust that makes collaboration possible. The wound, unhealed, becomes a lens that distorts everything that comes after. Letting go through forgiveness begins not with a decision, but with an understanding. The person who hurt you was operating from their own level of awareness, their own fears, their own unresolved history. This does not excuse them, but it contextualizes them. It makes them human rather than monstrous. which paradoxically makes it easier to release them from the role of villain in your ongoing internal narrative. The next step is what Luskin calls changing the channel, not suppressing the thought, but actively redirecting attention toward what matters in your current life, your current relationships, your current work, not because the past is irrelevant, but because the present is where your life is actually happening. The fifth lesson is about grief, not only the grief of death, which we are at least given social rituals to acknowledge, but the grief of every other ending that our culture largely refuses to honor. The grief of a friendship that quietly dissolved. The grief of a version of your life you planned carefully and then watched become impossible. The grief of a body that used to be able to do things it no longer can. The grief of an identity parent of a young child, person in love, creative, professional with a thriving career that you inhabited so fully and then had to leave behind. These griefs are real. They are not smaller than the grief of death. And the reason so many people get stuck is that they were never given permission to grieve them properly. The psychologist William Worden proposed that grief is not a passive emotional state you move through in stages, as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous model suggested, but an active process requiring specific tasks. You have to acknowledge the reality of the loss. You have to feel the pain rather than bypass it. You have to adjust to a world in which the lost thing is absent. And finally, you have to find a way to carry the memory of what you lost while still engaging fully with life. The reason people get stuck at one of these tasks is usually that the culture around them communicates, implicitly or explicitly, that what they are grieving is not significant enough to deserve real mourning. Get over it, move on, be grateful for what you have. All of which is well-meaning advice that functionally asks people to perform recovery before it has actually happened. The thing that behavioral psychology keeps discovering, in study after study, is that the fastest path through pain is directly through it. Avoidance. And we are all magnificent avoiders because we live in a world that has built an entire economy around helping us not feel things. Extends the duration of suffering. Every strategy for not feeling the grief, whether it is overworking, overdrinking, doom-scrolling, compulsive busyness, or reflexive optimism, adds time to the process. It does not eliminate the grief. It warehouses it. And warehouses grief does not age well. It tends to emerge at unexpected moments, triggered by seemingly unrelated events, with an intensity that seems disproportionate to what prompted it because it is carrying the weight of all the previous times it was suppressed in the AI economy. This is a lesson with particular urgency. An enormous number of people are currently grieving professional identities that automation is quietly dismantling. Writers who spent years honing a craft now watching AI generate serviceable content at scale. Graphic designers whose hourly rate is in freefall. Customer service professionals whose roles have been fully automated. This grief is legitimate. The loss of a sense of professional purpose, or belonging to a craft, is not small. But the people navigating this most successfully are not the ones pretending it does not hurt. They are the ones who allow themselves to grieve the identity that is ending, and then from that more honest emotional ground to begin asking what could come next. The sixth lesson is about control, and specifically about the exhausting and ultimately futile practice of trying to control things that are not controllable. The Stoics identified this as a central problem of human suffering more than 2,000 years ago. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and knew something about the difference between what a person controls and what they do not, wrote that everything in life falls into one of two categories: what is up to us and what is not up to us. Our judgments, our intentions, our responses, these are up to us. Everything else, other people's behavior, our reputation, the economy, the weather, the outcome of elections, whether our creative work is recognized, whether we get sick, these are not up to us. And the degree to which we blurred this distinction is the degree to which we suffer unnecessarily. Modern neuroscience has given this ancient wisdom a biological grounding. When our brain perceives a threat that we cannot control, it activates the stress response system, the familial flood of cortisol and adrenaline that prepares us to fight or flee. This system works beautifully for immediate physical threats. It is catastrophic when applied to chronic abstract worries. The person who spends weeks obsessing about what their manager thinks of them, or whether their business is Google reviews, are going to hurt their revenue, or whether a potential client is going to respond to their proposal, that person is running a biological stress response designed for emergency situations as a continuous background process. The long-term physiological effects are well documented: compromised immune function, disrupted sleep, impaired decision-making, shortened lifespan. The actionable practice here is not to stop caring about outcomes. It is to develop precision about where you direct your effort. You cannot control whether a client hires you. You can control the quality of your work, the clarity of your communication, the relationships you invest in. You cannot control whether the market rewards your skill set. You can control how consistently you develop it and how adaptable you remain. This is not passive resignation. It is radical focus, the practice of concentrating your energy so precisely on what is actually within your influence that none of it leaks out into the bottomless drain of worrying about what is not. The best freelancers understand this intuitively. They do not chase every client. They do not try to be everything to every market. They define what they do brilliantly. They do it with consistency, and they release the outcomes not because they do not care, but because caring about outcomes is a less effective use of energy than focusing on process. The seventh and final lesson is the one that ties everything together, and it is, in some ways, the most difficult to hear, because it asks you to let go of something more fundamental than a relationship or a career or a belief. It asks you to let go of the story of why you cannot change. We all have one. It is a narrative, constructed over years, from the accumulation of our experiences, our failures, our disappointments, and the things other people have told us about ourselves. Some of it is conscious, the version of it you tell other people, the shorthand explanation for why your life looks the way it does, but much of it operates below conscious awareness, as a set of assumptions so familiar that they feel like facts rather than interpretations. I am not the kind of person who takes risks. I am too old to start over. I am not naturally disciplined. I am not creative. I am too damaged by what happened to me. These narratives are not lies, exactly. They are usually built from real experiences, but they are incomplete. They take a data point and elevate it to a law. And once a limiting narrative becomes a law in your internal world, it starts to function like one. You stop seeing evidence that contradicts it. You stop attempting things that would disprove it. You construct a life that confirms it. And then you point to the life as proof. The psychologist Stan McAdams has spent decades studying what he calls narrative identity, the ongoing story each person tells about who they are and how they came to be that way. His research suggests that the stories we tell about our past are not fixed records of what happened. They are reconstructions, shaped by our current emotional state, our present goals, and our existing beliefs, which means that the story is not a constraint. It is a resource, one that can be revised. Not by pretending the difficult things did not happen, but by changing what you determine those difficult things to mean. The person who was told throughout their childhood that they were not smart enough can carry that as evidence that limits are real, or they can carry it as evidence that they learned early to function without external validation. The facts are identical. The meaning and the life that follows from it is entirely different. This is not a simple or quick process. Revising a core narrative requires sustained attention, often the support of a skilled therapist, always the willingness to sit with discomfort. But the starting point is accessible to anyone, and it begins with a single question. What is the story I tell about myself that I have never actually tested? Not the story I know is false, those are easier, but the story I have assumed is true without ever running a genuine experiment to find out. Here is what none of this will feel like. And I want to be honest about this because too much self-help literature glosses over it. It will not feel like relief at first. Letting go, genuinely letting go, feels like loss because it is loss. When you release a sunk cost, you are accepting that something you invested in is truly gone. When you interrupt a rumination loop, you are giving up the illusion that thinking about it one more time will somehow resolve it. When you loosen your grip on an identity, you are spending time in the uncomfortable space of not fully knowing who you are. When you forgive, you are relinquishing the protection of righteous anger. When you grieve honestly, you are choosing to feel the full weight of what is missing rather than the muted ache of something suppressed. When you release control, you are tolerating uncertainty. When you revise your story, you are admitting that the version you have been living from was incomplete. All of this is uncomfortable, and all of it is necessary, because here is the alternative, and this is what I want you to sit with as this, which comes to a close. The alternative to letting go is not safety. It is not stability. The alternative is a life lived in increasing contraction, where each unprocessed loss narrows your field of possibility a little more, where each identity you cannot release adds weight to every new endeavor, where each unexamined narrative about your own limitations becomes a self-fulfilling architecture. We do not feel this process happening because it is slow. We just notice, one day, that the things we used to feel excited about no longer interest us, that the risk we might have taken 5 years ago feels unthinkable now, that we have become very skilled at explaining to ourselves and others why change is not really possible. That moment of noticing, if you have felt it, even faintly, even just as a whisper of dissatisfaction that you usually silence with busyness, is a gift. It is your life telling you that something needs to be released. Not tomorrow, when it feels less scary. Not when you've figured out exactly what comes after. Now, with the uncertainty intact, with the grief acknowledged, with the story held lightly rather than defended fiercely. The art of letting go is not the absence of feeling. It is the practice of feeling fully, processing honestly, and then with intention, with courage, and with the understanding that you are not losing yourself, but making room for more of yourself, opening your hands. What are you still holding? That your future self will thank you for releasing. The question is not rhetorical. Sit with it. The answer that comes most quickly is probably the right one. And the fact that it frightens you is not a sign to hold tighter. It is a sign that you already know what needs to go. The rest is the work.